Have you ever wondered what it would feel like to be trapped in a glass sphere at the bottom of a plane while German fighters try to kill you? At 20,000 feet above Nazi Germany, in freezing temperatures of minus 40 degrees Celsius, you're spinning in circles trying to track a Messerschmitt hurtling toward you at 400 miles per hour? Now imagine that sphere stopping. It locks, and you can't escape. That's exactly what happened to 47 gun turret gunners between September and November 1943. Some were trapped in their turrets when bombers hit. Others were blown to pieces because they couldn't turn their guns to defend their aircraft. The B-17 Flying Fortress, a four-engine bomber developed before World War II, had a fatal flaw that was killing American airmen every week. And everyone thought the problem lay with the maintenance crews. Staff Sergeant Roy Kellerman was 34 when he volunteered for gun turret duty. This made him old by Air Force standards. Most gunners were 19, maybe 20. They were kids who could fit inside a 44-inch diameter sphere and not go crazy with claustrophobia. But Kellerman was no gunner. Before Pearl Harbor, he had been a light heavyweight boxer in Detroit. He knew how to stay calm when someone tried to hurt him. He knew how to think clearly when his body was panicking. That's why Lieutenant Marcus Whitmore wanted Kellerman on his crew. Whitmore, meanwhile, was 26 and a pilot who had dropped out of Michigan State's engineering program before the war and started working in his father's garage. He understood machinery. He understood how things broke and why. When he looked at his B-17, he didn't just see an airplane. He saw a collection of systems that had to work perfectly, or everyone would die. On November 12, 1943, Whitmore's crew was assigned a bombing mission to Bremen. The target was a submarine base. The 8th Air Force was sending out 236 B-17s. Intelligence had predicted heavy fighter resistance. The German Luftwaffe was absolutely brutal that fall. American bomber crews had virtually no chance of completing the required 25 missions before being killed, wounded, or captured. Do you think they would have? At 0630, Kellerman climbed into the gun turret. The turret was arguably the most terrifying position in any aircraft ever designed. It hung like a glass ward under the bomber's belly. The gunner sat with his knees drawn up, feet in the stirrups, two .50 caliber machine guns pointed forward. The entire assembly could rotate 360 degrees and could fire the guns from directly below to almost directly overhead. It was a marvelous feat of engineering. It was also a death trap. The gun turret entered the aircraft through a hatch in the fuselage floor. Once inside, someone would close the hatch above you. You were locked inside. The only way out was for someone to return the turret to its exit position and properly align the hatch. If the turret's hydraulic system failed while you were moving away from the exit position, you were trapped. You couldn't get out, and if the aircraft had to make an emergency landing with the landing gear down, the turret would hit the ground first. Every turret gunner knew this. They would climb in anyway. Whitmore made his pre-flight rounds that morning while his crew loaded ammunition and checked the systems. Technical Sergeant Vincent DeLuca was the crew's gunner in charge of all weapons. DeLuca, a 29-year-old Italian-American from the Bronx, spoke more with his hands than his mouth. He had been working on aircraft weapons since 1940. Whitmore crawled under the aircraft while Kellerman finished inspecting the turret. DeLuca looked worried. Whitmore asked what was wrong. DeLuca pointed to the turret's rotation mechanism. He said it felt sticky during the test rotation. It wasn't broken, just not smooth. It felt like there was some resistance in the system that shouldn't have been there. Whitmore asked if they should scrub the turret for this mission. DeLuca nodded. He said the turret was working. It just didn't feel right, but it wasn't his imagination. The 7 o'clock mission briefing was standard. Primary target, submarine shelters. Secondary target, railroad stations. Altitude, 7,200 meters. Fighter escort, P-47. Thunderbolts would escort them to the German border and pick them up on their way back. But above the target, the bombers would be on their own for about 45 minutes. That's when the German fighters would hit them. The briefer showed gun camera footage from last week's Schweinfurt mission. The footage showed Messerschmitt Bf-109s charging directly at the bombers at over 500 mph, 800 kilometers per hour. The Me-109s would fire their 20mm cannons and then pull away at the last second. Some couldn't get away in time. Everyone was killed by German fighter planes colliding with B-17s. Briefing officer gun turret. He said that artillery was critical to defending against attacks from below. German fighters had learned that American bombers had a blind spot below them. So they would swoop down formation, and fire into the bomb bays where the fuel tanks were located. If you entered a bomb bay full of fuel, the bomber would explode. No parachutes, no survivors, just debris falling from the sky. The turret gunners could see these attacks coming. They could neutralize the fighters before they could get into position. They could save their planes. That's why the turret was so crucial. That's why Kellerman's position was so crucial. Do you think they could save them? They took off at 0812. Whitmore's B-17, Yankee Doodle, was flying in position 5 of the lead squadron. They rose, formed formation over England, and headed for Germany. The English Channel was gray and cold below them. Kellerman rotated his turret, tested the guns, and scanned the sky below and behind the formation. Everything was normal. The turret was moving smoothly. The guns were tracking smoothly. Kellerman had done this 11 times before. This was mission number 12. He needed 13 more to get home. At 0947, they entered German airspace. The P-47 escorts left at 0958. They were on their own. Radio chatter intensified. Pilots were announcing fighter positions. Bandits, 12 o'clock. 109's diving. Me-1110 twin engine, 3 o'clock. Kellerman spotted his first German fighter at 10:08, an Me-109 diving into the formation 300 meters away. He fired at another B-17, missed, and began to climb. Kellerman followed with his turret but didn't fire. Out of range. Saved the ammunition for close-range fire. Then the real attacks began. At 10:14, as the briefing officer had warned, 3 Me-19s arrived from below. From 6,000 feet below, they climbed rapidly into formation. Kellerman spotted them as tiny dots. He called over the public address system. "Fighters, 6 o'clock, climbing." Whitmore's voice came back. "I see them, Roy. They're all yours." Kellerman turned the turret, pointed his guns down and back, and trained on the target. The fighters were climbing in loose file. He picked out the leader. He waited. The Me-109 grew. 800 yards, 600 yards for the trigger. 250 caliber rounds were fired. Tracers extended. He could see their rounds heading for the target. Hits on the... The Me-109 rolled to the right, breaking off the attack. The other two scattered as... Kellerman had protected his bomber from the attack his briefing officer had warned about. His turret had saved their lives. Then the turret stopped working. It all happened so fast that Kellerman almost didn't realize what was wrong. He tried to turn left to follow another fighter. The turret moved about 10 degrees and stopped. It locked up. The hydraulic motor was working, and he could hear it, but the turret wouldn't move. He was stuck. He was looking back and down. He couldn't see ahead. He couldn't see up. He couldn't track targets. He couldn't defend his aircraft. And they were still 40 minutes from the target, and German fighters were swarming. Kellerman's first thought was calm. He'd been trained for this. The procedure for a jammed turret was clear. Disconnect the hydraulic motor, engage the manual crank, manually rotate the turret to its exit position. Exit, okay. Crank handle wouldn't work either. He tried. The lever arm rotated, but nothing happened. The turret didn't move. The mechanical linkage between the lever arm and the rotation gear worked, but something was preventing the turret from rotating. Kellerman was a professional. He didn't panic. He called Whitmore on the intercom. "Lieutenant, the turret is jammed. It can't rotate. The manual lever arm isn't working. I need help." Whitmore's response came immediately. "Can you get out?" "No. The turret isn't aligned with the exit hatch. I'm locked in." A silence fell. Then Whitmore spoke the words Kellerman had dreaded. "Calm down, Roy. We'll figure this out. Keep trying the lever arm." But Kellerman already knew the lever arm wouldn't work. Something was jammed. Something was blocking rotation, and he didn't know what. For the next 35 minutes, Kellerman remained trapped in his turret as German fighters attacked the squadron. He heard the sounds of combat over the intercom. He heard the hip-firing gunners calling out targets. He heard the upper turret gunner fire. He heard explosions. He heard someone scream. But below and behind them, he saw nothing but empty sky. He couldn't help. He couldn't fight. He just sat there in a glass sphere waiting to die. The 2 B-17s in his plans were shot down. Kellerman heard the radio calls. He heard the pilots say they were hit, their engines were burning, and they were losing altitude. He heard the screams stop as the plane fell. He wondered if those bombers had turret gunners. They were trapped in their turrets, trapped, grounding their aircraft, and they knew they couldn't get out. Whitmore brought the Yankee Doodle home on 3 engines. The third engine had been hit by anti-aircraft fire over the target and had to be shut down. They limped back across Germany in formation, reached the English Channel, and returned to England. P-47s picked them up. The German fighters withdrew. At 1:40 p.m., Whitmore landed at Thorpe Abbotts. As soon as the plane stopped moving, DeLuca and 2 other crew members worked to free Kellerman. It took 18 minutes. They had to manually turn the turrets using pry bars and brute force. When the hatch was finally aligned, Kellerman emerged, sweating despite the freezing cold. His legs could barely support him. He had been trapped in that gun for over 6 hours. DeLuca immediately examined the turret. He found the problem in less than 5 minutes. The main bearing assembly that allowed the turret to rotate had jammed. The bearing was a delicate component and required constant lubrication. But the lubrication system had failed. The bearing had dried out, overheated, expanded from the heat, and seized. A classic mechanical failure. It happens sometimes. That's what the maintenance manual said. But Kellerman wasn't the only problem. That same day, 3 other gun turrets in the group had jammed during a mission. All 3 gunners returned safe and sound, but all 3 turrets were jammed. Same problem. Bearing failure. Same cause. Lubrication system failure. 4 turrets in one mission. This was unusual, but not unprecedented. The maintenance man blamed the cold weather. He said the hydraulic fluid was too thick at high altitude. He said they would switch to a lighter fluid. The problem was resolved. But it wasn't. The following week, 11 more gun turrets jammed during combat missions. Some gunners survived, some didn't. On November 18th, a B-17 from the 351st Bombardment Group made an emergency landing in England with the gun turret gunner still trapped inside. The turret was jammed over France. The pilot couldn't rotate the turret to its exit position. When the bomber hit the ground, the gun turret hit first. The gunner was crushed. His name was Private Daniel Ortiz. He was 19 years old and from New Mexico. 3 days later, his mother received a telegram informing her that her son had been killed in action. The investigation into Ortiz's death concluded that it was an equipment failure, not pilot error, not maintenance error, just bad luck. The bearing had failed. That's what happened. Replace the lubrication system. Move on. But Marcus Whitmore didn't continue. Because Whitmore was a mechanic before he became a pilot. Mechanics know that when the same part fails repeatedly, it's not bad luck. It's a design problem. Whitmore went to the maintenance hangar at 10:00 p.m. on November 19th. The hangar was mostly empty. Most of the crew was asleep or in the barracks. On the night shift, a bomber that had returned with battle damage was being worked on. Whitmore found Staff Sergeant Bill Holloway, the maintenance manager. Holloway was 41 years old, a practicing soldier, and had been working on aircraft since the days of biplanes. Whitmore asked Holloway if he could examine a gun turret that had jammed. Holloway asked why. Whitmore said he wanted to understand what was wrong. Holloway took him to a turret that had been removed from an aircraft earlier that day. The turret was sitting on a partially disassembled maintenance stand. Whitmore examined the bearing assembly. The bearing was a steel ring, about 20 centimeters in diameter, with precision ball bearings rotating in a groove. The bearing ensured the smooth rotation of the entire turret. It must have been lubricated by a small hydraulic pump that fed oil to the bearing surface. Whitmore checked the pump. It was working. I checked the oil lines. They were clean. The lubrication system was working perfectly. So why was the bearing running dry? Whitmore got his hands dirty. He completely disassembled the bearing assembly. He examined every component, and then he found it. The problem wasn't the pump. It wasn't the oil lines. It was the bearing. The bearing surface had microscopic grooves. These grooves directed oil away from the high pressure points where the bearing needed the most lubrication. The oil was flowing right past the critical surfaces. Why were there grooves? Because the bearing was designed for use at sea level in normal temperatures. But ball turrets were operating at 25,000 feet in temperatures as cold as 40 degrees Celsius. At that temperature, metal shrinks. Bearing components shrink at different rates. Steel shrinks differently than bronze bushings. This differential shrinkage creates microscopic stress points. Over time, these stress points create grooves in the bearing surface. The grooves draw away the oil. The bearing was drying out. The bearing seized. This was a design flaw. The bearing wasn't designed for the thermal conditions in which it was actually operating. Every gun turret in the 8th Air Force had the same bearing, every single one, and they all had the same grooves. Eventually, they would all fail. That's just it was a matter of time. Whitmore explained this to Holloway. Holloway listened intently. Then he asked, "So what do we do about this?" Whitmore said, "We need to modify the bearing to resist thermal contraction. We need to add a different lubrication route that doesn't rely on the bearing surface remaining perfectly smooth." Holloway said, "That's an engineering modification. That requires manufacturer approval. Sperry would have to redesign the bearing. That would take months. We don't have months." Whitmore asked, "What if we do it ourselves?" Holloway looked at him. "You want to change a critical flight control system without authorization?" "I want to keep the gunners from dying." Holloway thought about this for a long time. Then he asked, "What do you need?" This is where you need to understand something about the military in 1943. Regulations said equipment couldn't be changed without authorization. But the reality was, crews were dying. And sometimes the people in the field knew better than the engineers in the United States what was really going on. Sometimes survival meant breaking the rules. Whitmore spent the next 2 days trying to find a solution. He worked with Vincent DeLuca because DeLuca knew the gun turret better than anyone else on the base. Together, they came up with a modification that would work. The plan was simple. They would drill a secondary lubrication channel directly into the bearing housing. This channel would feed oil to the high pressure points on the bearing surface, regardless of whether the original bearing surface remained smooth. They would use a small brass fitting from a hydraulic line as the feed point. The oil would be pressurized by the existing pump. The modification would take about 45 minutes per turret. It would require no special tools. Any crew chief could do it, but he was completely unauthorized. If anything went wrong, if the turret failed due to the modification, Whitmore and DeLuca would be court-martialed. They would go to jail. Whitmore didn't care. Kellerman nearly died in his plane. Daniel Ortiz was crushed to death in his turret. 47 gunners were trapped. How many more had to die before they could do anything? At 3:00 a.m. on November 21st, Whitmore and DeLuca modified their first gun turret. They worked in the rear of the maintenance hangar, out of sight. DeLuca had the tools, Whitmore had the plan. They removed the bearing housing of a turret that had seized the day before. They marked the high pressure point on the bearing surface. They drilled a 1/8-inch channel through the bearing. They installed the brass fitting. They tested the oil flow. Perfect. The oil had now reached the critical surface. The bearing rotated smoothly, even after 20 minutes under load. They reinstalled the modified bearing in the turret. They tested the turret rotation. It was glass smooth, no resistance. It didn't stick. The modification worked. They had solved the problem that was killing the gun turret gunners, but now they had to prove it worked in combat. And they had to do it without anyone knowing they had violated every rule in the maintenance manual. Do you think this modification would work in combat? The testing went faster than Whitmore had anticipated. On November 23rd, the order was given to attack Berlin at maximum power. All available bombers in the 8th Air Force were to fly. The target was the ball-bearing factories in the city center. Intelligence estimated that 400 German fighter jets would intervene. It would be the largest air battle in history. Whitmore's crew was scheduled to fly. The Yankee Doodle was undergoing a full inspection and rearmament. DeLuca was checking all the weapons. And Whitmore made a decision that could end his career or save his life. Probably both. He told DeLuca to install the modified ball bearing in the gun turrets. DeLuca looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded. They did it at Oro Hung on November 24th. No one saw it. No one knew. The modification took 38 minutes. When they finished, Kellerman's gun turret had a bearing that could operate at 40 degrees Celsius. At least they hoped so. Kellerman hadn't heard about the modification. Whitmore didn't tell him. He didn't tell anyone on the crew either. If anything went wrong, Whitmore wanted to be the only one facing charges. The crew needed to be able to honestly say they knew nothing about the unauthorized modifications. But Whitmore told Holloway. He had to. Holloway was the head of maintenance. If the turret malfunctioned and killed someone, Holloway needed to know why. Holloway listened to Whitmore's explanation. Then he said something Whitmore would never forget. "I didn't see you do anything to that turret. As far as I know, you only did a standard inspection. But if it works, you'll know." "Tell me now." "Because we have 140 more turrets at this base that need to go through the same inspection." The mission briefing on November 24th was somber. The briefing officer didn't lighten the mood. The bombers, he said they would lose theirs. Probably too many bombers. The Luftwaffe would throw everything at them. The fighter escort would only be able to stay with them for part of the mission. They would be alone over Berlin for 50 minutes. Make peace with whatever God you believe in. Write a letter home. Check your parachutes. Kellerman climbed into the spherical turret at 06:45. He'd done this 12 times already. This was the 13th mission. An unlucky number. He tried not to think about it. He tried not to think about being trapped in his turret over Bremen. He tried not to think about Daniel Ortiz being crushed under the bomber. He just focused on the job. Get into the turrets, man the guns, scan the sky, kill the German fighters, go home. They took off at 07:38. The weather was terrible. Overcast, freezing rain, visibility less than a mile. The squadron gathered above the clouds. 236 B-17s circled over England, gaining altitude and settling into their combat areas. Whitmore flew Yankee Doodle to the lead squadron's third point. A good position. Close to the lead, good mutual defense, but not the most exposed. At 08:21, they headed east. They crossed the English Channel. At 08:56, they entered German airspace. Their P-47 escorts were with them. Kellerman could see them circling above the squadron, watching for German fighters. He tested his turret. He turned left, straight. He turned right, straight. He raised the guns. Everything was perfect. In fact, better than perfect. The turret was responding faster than he remembered, less drag. It was as if someone had greased it thoroughly. How much of a blessing did you think this cleverness was at the time? He didn't know the turret had a bearing assembly that wasn't mentioned in any maintenance manual. The German fighters hit them at 09:24. Kellerman saw them coming from 20 miles away, black spots against the clouds, dozens, Me-109s, FW-190s, even a few Me-410 twin-engine destroyers with heavy guns. Radio chatter erupted. Every pilot in the formation was reporting their positions. Bandits at 12 o'clock, fighters at 3 o'clock, 190s coming at 9 o'clock. Kellerman swiveled his turret, tracking the targets. 3 Me-109s dove through the formation, 350 meters to his right. They fired at another B-17, hitting its second engine. The engine burst into flames. The B-17 plummeted out of formation. Kellerman didn't even look to see if anyone was landing. Then the attacks began from below. 4 FW-190s climbing from 1,500 meters below slid below the formation where Kellerman could see them. They were climbing rapidly in a diamond formation. They were probably traveling at 360 kilometers per hour. Kellerman shouted, "I'm going to take off." Fighters, 6 o'clock, were climbing fast. Whitmore's voice. "Fire, Roy." Kellerman turned the turret down and back. The turret moved instantly. There was no hesitation. There was no resistance. He aimed the guns at the leading 190, guided the target, waited. The fighter closed in. 600 yards, 500, 400. Kellerman fired. 250 caliber cannons went off like hammers. He could feel the vibration throughout the turret. The spent cartridges ejected from the mechanism were supposed to be collected in a bag, but some always came loose and rattled around his feet. He directed his fire at the target. He saw it hit the FW-190's cowling. The fighter's propeller exploded. Fragments flew. The 190 careened to the right and crashed, leaving smoke and coolant. Kellerman didn't watch it fall. He was already following the second fighter. The second FW-190 saw his partner hit and broke off the attack. It turned sharply to the left. Kellerman followed, rotating his turret. The turret moved smoothly, tracking the target perfectly. He guided the fighter, firing a 2-second burst of fire. He missed. The 190 was turning too hard. But Kellerman stayed with him, continued rotating his turret, and aimed his guns at the fighter's destination. He fired again. This time he hit. He hit the wing root. The 190's left wing folded. The fighter was knocked out. 2 enemy aircraft in 40 seconds, and his turret had worked perfectly. It had done exactly what it was supposed to do. It turned smoothly, without hesitation or resistance, during every maneuver. For the next 45 minutes, Kellerman fought with his turret against every German fighter that approached the bomber. He fired 900 rounds. He scored 3 more hits on the enemy aircraft, keeping the fighters away from the Yankee Doodles. And through it all, his turret never wavered. It never got stuck. It never gave him a moment's doubt. Other bombers weren't so lucky. Kellerman saw a B-17 2 positions ahead take multiple hits from below. The bomber's gun turret wouldn't rotate. It simply hung there, facing backward, while an Me-109 below him opened fire on the bomb bay. The B-17 exploded. 14 men were gone in an instant. Kellerman rotated his turret and found the Me-109, the man who had killed them. The German fighter was climbing, probably thinking it was safe. Kellerman followed, guided flawlessly, and fired a 5-second burst. The Me-109 was destroyed. Revenge in war wasn't supposed to feel good, but Kellerman wouldn't lie to himself. It felt good. They dropped their bombs on Berlin at 10:47. The anti-aircraft fire was ferocious. Black blast clouds filled the sky. Shrapnel ricocheted off the Yankee Doodle's aluminum hull like hail. A fragment of anti-aircraft fire pierced the ground near Kellerman's turret, missing him by 8 inches. Kellerman didn't even flinch. He just kept looking for the fighters. The flight home was worse than the one back. German fighters followed them all the way to the coast. The P-47s didn't pick them up until they crossed into Belgium. By then, the squadron had lost 31 bombers. Kellerman watched 6 of them crash. Some exploded, others spiraled down, leaving a trail of fire. Some of them slowly lost altitude as their engines failed, disappearing into the clouds below. Each carried 10 people. Some survived, most did not. The Yankee Doodle reached home with 2 damaged engines and 47 holes in its fuselage. Whitmore landed at 1:12 p.m. When the engines shut down, the sudden silence was unnatural. Kellerman remained in his turret for another minute. He sat there, his hands were shaking. Despite the freezing cold, his overalls were soaked with sweat. His legs had cramped hours earlier, but he was alive, and the turret was functioning. DeLuca rescued him. Kellerman climbed onto the runway, his legs barely holding him. The ground crew had already gathered around the bomber, counting the holes and inspecting the damage. Kellerman looked at Whitmore, who was standing near the nose of the plane, talking to the crew chief. Whitmore met his gaze. He nodded once. Kellerman nodded back. They both knew something was different about that mission. The turret had worked better than it should have. But neither of them said anything out loud, not yet. The post-fight report listed Kellerman with 4 confirmed kills and 2 probable kills. It was the highest score for any turret gunner that day. The intelligence officer asked Kellerman what was different. How had he achieved so many kills while the other gunners struggled? Kellerman said he didn't know. He had been lucky with his shots. The intelligence officer noted it as excellent gunnery, but it wasn't luck. A pilot, a former mechanic, had drilled a 1/8-inch hole in a bearing race. That night, Whitmore and DeLuca met with Holloway in the maintenance hangar. Whitmore said the modification worked perfectly. 0 problems. The turret had operated flawlessly throughout the entire mission, despite temperatures below 40 degrees Celsius and constant rotation under the stress of combat. No bearings had seized. It hadn't even shown any signs of resistance. Holloway asked how many turrets had failed that day. Whitmore said he checked the post-operation reports. 8 gun turrets had become stuck during the mission. 2 of these gunners were killed when the bombers crashed. The other 6 made it home but were trapped in their turrets for hours, unable to fight or escape. 8 turrets. The same problem. The same thermal shrinkage that caused the bearings to seize. The same design flaw that no one at Sperry Engineering had foreseen because they had never tested the turrets at operational altitude under combat conditions. Holloway made a life-saving and potentially career-ending decision. He told Whitmore and DeLuca to modify every gun turret in the squadron. Do it quietly. Do it at night. Don't tell the pilots or gunners. Just do it. And keep detailed notes on each turret they modified in case something went wrong and they needed to prove they had done it carefully. Over the next 4 nights, Whitmore and DeLuca modified 23 gun turrets. They worked from 11 o'clock p.m. to 4 o'clock a.m. each night. They drilled the bearing housings. They installed the brass fittings. They tested the oil flow. They reinstalled the bearings. Each change took about 40 minutes. They worked in the back corner of the maintenance hangar where the lighting was poor and no one could see them. By November 28th, every bomber in Whitmore's squadron had a modified gun turret. None of the crew chiefs knew. None of the pilots knew. Certainly not the gunners. The planes went on missions with turrets that worked better than they should, and the results were immediate. On December 1st, the squadron flew a mission to Solingen. The gun turrets never seized. December 3rd, a mission to Emden, no seize. December 5th, Frankfurt, no seize. For 2 weeks, not a single gun turret in Whitmore's squadron stuck during combat operations. Other squadrons in the group continued to lose turrets to bearing failures. Other squadron commanders noticed this. They started asking questions. Why were the 359th Squadron's gun turrets working perfectly while everyone else was still having problems? What were these? Are they doing anything different? Holloway told them he had better maintenance procedures, more frequent inspections, careful lubrication. Other squadrons tried the same procedures. It didn't help. Their turrets were seizing up. Only the 359th Squadron had reliable turrets, and no one could figure out why. Until everything fell apart on December 13th. Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments and like the video. Colonel Harrison Webb, who had commanded the 359th Bombardment Group since August, was a rule-abiding officer. He was 38 years old, a West Point graduate, had flown bombers in training but never in combat. He ran his group by regulations. Every regulation, every protocol, every procedure, exactly as the manual said. On December 13th, Colonel Webb ordered a surprise maintenance inspection of the entire group. He wanted to see why one squadron's gun turrets were performing better than the others. He brought in 3 technical inspectors from the 8th Air Force headquarters. These were no ordinary technicians. These were engineering experts who knew every specification, every tolerance, and every approved modification. At 8 a.m., they began inspecting the ball-bearing turrets. By 9:45 a.m., they had discovered Whitmore and DeLuca's modification. The inspector disassembled the bearing housing of the 3rd turret he examined, saw the drilled channel and brass fitting, and immediately realized it wasn't factory standard. He summoned Colonel Webb, showed him the modification, and asked who had the authorization on file for this modification. There was no authorization on file, because there was no authorization. Webb ordered an inspection of all the ball-bearing turrets in the fleet. By 11 a.m., they had found 23 modified turrets. They were all identical. They all had the same drilled channel and brass fitting. All were unauthorized. All were in direct violation of Technical Order 011B50, which explicitly prohibited field modifications to any flight control system without written approval from the manufacturer and the Air Force Engineering Command. Webb wanted names. Who did it? Who authorized it? Inspectors followed the pattern of modifications. All 23 turrets had been modified between November 24th and 28th. Maintenance records showed routine inspections on those dates, but nothing about the modifications. Someone had done it off the record. Someone had deliberately concealed it. Holloway could have lied. He could have said he knew nothing. He could have protected Whitmore and DeLuca, but Holloway was a career soldier. He wouldn't lie to his superiors. When Webb called him at 12:30 and asked him directly who had modified the turrets, Holloway told the truth. He had approved the attack. Lieutenant Whitmore had designed the modification. Technical. Sergeant DeLuca had helped install it. They had done it without approval because gunners were dying, and the approved solution was taking too long. Webb asked Holloway if he understood what he had done was a crime worthy of a court-martial. Holloway said, "Yes, sir, I understand." Webb asked Holloway if he had any idea what would happen if one of these modified turrets malfunctioned and killed a gunner. Holloway said, "Yes, sir, I've thought about it thoroughly." Webb asked Holloway if he had considered what would happen to his career, his pension, and his life if he went to military prison for unauthorized modifications that led to deaths. Holloway said he thought of Daniel Ortiz being crushed in his turret over France. He thought of 47 gunners trapped. He thought of all 8 turrets trapped over Berlin and the single modified turret functioning perfectly. He thought of those things more than he thought of his career. Webb ordered Holloway, Whitmore, and DeLuca confined to the barracks until the court-martial was complete. He grounded the Yankee Doodle and towed it off the flight line. He ordered all 23 modified turrets to be dismantled and replaced with factory-standard units. He sent a classified report to 8th Air Force headquarters, documenting the unauthorized modifications and recommending charges against 3 privates and 1 officer for violating technical orders, conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline, and reckless endangerment. The report reached headquarters on December 14th. It should have ended there. 3 men broke the rules, were punished, and the case was closed. But someone at headquarters had actually read the technical details of Whitmore's actions. He had read about the heat shrinkage problem. He had read about the groove formation on the bearing surface. He had read about the secondary lubrication channel solution. This person was Mej. Donald Peterson, an engineer who had worked at Sperry before the war. Peterson was familiar with ball turrets and had helped design them. When he read Whitmore's analysis of why the bearings had failed, he realized Whitmore was right. The bearings weren't designed for the thermal conditions they were actually experiencing. This was a design flaw. Sperry had overlooked it. Peterson crunched the numbers. He performed thermal shrinkage calculations. It was confirmed that steel and bronze shrink at different rates, temperature differences of 40 degrees KSI. It was confirmed that the differential would create stress points. These stress points would eventually wear out the grooves in the bearing surface. Everything Whitmore had calculated was correct. More importantly, Whitmore's solution was elegant. A secondary lubrication channel bypassed the deteriorated bearing surface, feeding oil directly to the high-pressure points. Simple, effective. It could be done by any crew chief with basic tools. And according to combat reports, it worked perfectly. 0 failures in 23 turrets in 47 combat missions. Peterson wrote his own report and sent it to Engineering Command with a recommendation that Whitmore's modification be officially tested and potentially adopted as a field modification for all gun turrets in the theater. He also recommended that the charges against Whitmore, DeLuca, and Holloway be dropped pending the results of the tests. The tests took place at Wright Field in Ohio. They removed a gun turret from a combat-hardened B-17, installed Whitmore's modification, and operated it in a thermal chamber at 40 degrees Celsius, 40 degrees Fahrenheit, for 50 hours. The bearing never seized. It showed no signs of resistance. Oil flow to high-pressure points remained constant. The modification performed as Whitmore had predicted. They also tested an unmodified turret under the same conditions. After 31 hours, it seized. The grooves Whitmore described appeared on the bearing surface. The lubrication system failed, as Whitmore had predicted. On January 8, 1944, the Army Air Forces Engineering Command issued Technical Order 011B50, Modification 7, authorizing field modification of Sperry gun turret bearing assemblies using a procedure developed by First Lieutenant Marcus Whitmore of the 359th Bombardment Group, 8th Air Force. The modification became mandatory for all B-17s in the European theater. Sperry incorporated the design change into all new production turrets starting in February 1944. The charges against Whitmore, DeLuca, and Holloway were dropped, but they received no commendation. They weren't even awarded medals. They weren't even officially thanked. Whitmore's name wasn't mentioned in the technical order. It simply described the modification procedure. The official explanation was that Air Force engineers had identified and corrected a bearing lubrication deficiency. No mention was made of the fact that a former mechanic, a pilot, was the first to notice it. Colonel Webb was furious. He wanted those men court-martialed. He wanted them punished for violating regulations. He didn't care whether the modification worked or not. The regulations were there for a reason. It's not possible for every mechanic and pilot to decide which regulations to follow and which to ignore. That's chaos. That's how you lose discipline. That's how you lose control, by people who didn't wait for permission to bail out. Sometimes those people were punished. Sometimes they were quietly cleared. Sometimes they go back to their normal routine and never talk about it. If you found this story as powerful as we did, take a moment to like this video. These stories matter. These people matter. If you want to hear more forgotten history from World War II, subscribe to this channel. Real stories of real people who achieved extraordinary things without expecting recognition. And leave a comment below. Let us know where you're watching. Let us know if you know someone who served. Let us know if you've ever had to choose between following the rules and doing the right thing. We read every comment. This community is made up of people who believe these stories deserve to be remembered. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these histories alive.